Hello, it's the 13th of August 2026. I wanted to finish off the discussion of John Locke, which I did yesterday, which I finished after 1.5 hours. And I will now read out and consider my conclusions, or some conclusions. After looking at the political and metaphysical work of Locke, I have two remaining questions. Firstly, is Locke's description of government the basis for a political movement or a party? You could say, if a man believes his theory of government, then we should ask, is he what is called a liberal? Equally, should this theory be accepted as a description of actual political situation of England? Is it true? Can it be made to be true in some sense? My comment on this would be quickly that what Locke has done in this political treatise is give a kind of theoretical story of the origin of states and the parts which make them up. And his fundamental units in the state, fundamental units of political measurement, is the individual. And from this, he can then work out what the state of nature is, which is a state a condition where the individual is on his own. And he also works out what the natural law is, the law under which individuals live, which is that they must survive. This very simple scheme is probably too simple for some people to understand, but that is what Locke means when he talks about the condition of nature and the law of nature. In addition to the individual on his own, Locke also posits the voice of God, which is in other places is called reason. And reason is what allows and impels a man to survive. Note also that a man must survive because he is not the ultimate owner of his own life. He must do it as a duty, because the ultimate ownership of his life belongs to God. So if he's obedient to God, then he will survive. And as we know, in a state of nature, when a man comes across other people, it's often in the form of thieves who try to take his property from him, because his property is his means of survival. So the man in a state of nature is frequently obliged to defend his property by killing the thief. In Locke's theory, the reason why states or governments are formed is because the chain of events which is caused by a murder of one man involves attempted murder on him in return. And this is not a sustainable way of life, because such a life wouldn't last very long, statistically speaking. And so it's a better deal to carry on living according to the rules of nature, the law of nature, which is that you must survive and look after your property, but with the protection and the agreement of everybody else you might come across. And so people voluntarily submit to perhaps a temporary agreement to belong to a state. Now, this is not, strictly speaking, temporary. It's not a temporary arrangement, because anybody who joins in to become a member of that community does so theoretically for life. And we call this loyalty. And this is the only way that a state can work, really. It's if it is assumed and the members make a promise that they will continue to exist in the state rather than in a condition of nature for all time. And this is how people learn to trust one another, because they're all equally obliged to commit to lifelong membership. So it is not exactly stressed over and over again in Locke's work, but it seems to me that the act of loyalty is what causes the step across from the state of nature to the state of civil society. And this basic structure of a voluntary submission to the law for the sake of your individual self-interest is I suppose, what we typically call classical liberalism. And Locke's second treatise, and it's also indicated in the first treatise, Locke's theory of politics is basically as simple as that. And it only remains to show what is the best form of government that they should assume when they are together, these people, these individuals. And that naturally must be one which is representative and one which is interested in the law, because the legislative is the government, and their prime function is to enact laws. And the person who they have overall in charge is the executive, and he must behave according to those laws and do things for the people. Now, Locke doesn't say anything about what the executive should do. It's clear that what the legislative should do is serve the people, protect their property, and allow them to be individually free. As for the executive, his function, or that is the king, must be more or less limited to the gathering of tax for the sake of national protection against foreign enemies, because the other states which might form around your nation exist in a state of nature with regard to your nation. That is, at any time they could be tempted to steal your property, or in other words, to declare war and to try to invade, or the various other objectives of war. So the executive's prime purpose in life is to lead the nation in a time of war. I think that elsewhere Locke points out that this was the case for the Hebrews in the Old Testament period, when the judges spent their time fighting the foreign enemies, and the judges were basically a form of a king, but not without a crown, as it were. They were called judges, but they acted like war leaders. They acted like kings. And the Hebrews also finally came to accept a king. And David spent most of his time at war, which is what the ultimate purpose of the executive of government is. Locke doesn't say very much anything else about how the executive and legislative shall organise society, because, and I think this is because in his time, the government simply did not organise the society. It left people free to do as they wanted within the power that they had by means of their property. It's a question I could ask myself, and I do ask myself, whether in an era where government and nations have to be so highly organised in order to survive, whether this theory can still continue to apply. And Bertrand Russell, as we've noticed, did not think it could any longer be a valid political theory because of the need for organisation. But I think that he was also prejudiced in favour of redistribution of property to all men equally, which was completely contrary to the idea expressed by Locke, who thought that each man had a God-given right to his property, because without his property he could not survive. Before I continue to read, I'd also like to point out that with our current problems and troubles in this nation, vis-a-vis other nations and invasions of foreigners and so on, what continually strikes the normal man must be the question, how shall we survive in this kind of world? Within 50 years, it's repeatedly said in our time, the British people will no longer be a majority, and then they will be in serious danger. So the principle that the individual must survive, which is a God-given command, applies today with equal power. And it is clear to me that the governments have simply forgotten about this problem, and they do not take the invasion and the rise of non-British people inside Britain to be serious, because they don't realise, or even if they did realise that our survival was at stake, they do not seem to think that it is what you might call a God-given command that you shall survive. Again, I have a suspicion that men like Bertrand Russell, who was a socialist before socialism became very popular, would not really have cared about the survival of Britain or the British people. So he had reason to be a bit exasperated by John Locke's political theories, and this is why he reads them so badly, if you ask me. But I'm not going to make this talk a means by which to speak about our contemporary problems and to make a case for loyalty and survival. I just notice that these are the things which, at the foundation of our nation in 1689, this was clearly stated as the point of the classical liberal theory. If we accept the grounds for Locke's arguments, then we must accept the consequences. So, if the state of nature is what he says it is, and the reason for the origin of nations is as he says it is, then similarly there must be acceptance of the consequence, namely that the legislative must do the work of the people, or it will face being dissolved. That is, if the government will not work for the survival of the people, then it must be overthrown. Locke asks, in his typically unbothered, pragmatic way, whether an executive or a king could live with a situation where he is continually in danger of being overthrown, when the individuals of the nation can overthrow him by right. But he answers this by saying that in practice, and on the basis of his psychological insight, he believes that the dissolution of government or the overthrow of a monarchy, or the rebellion against a government, will only ever take place when the evil of that government is so obvious and so intentional that the greater part of the nation can see it. And that they are, as a result, able to band together and achieve the overthrow. But where the government has no intention to harm the people, there will in practice be a larger number of people who will prefer that their government continues just as it is, with some slight modifications, rather than allow a usurper and a small band of troublemakers to succeed in a revolution. What we see here is Locke considering in a empirical way how a society set up with the basic premise that it can be overthrown by violent revolution at any time will usually survive on the basis that when the government is aware of this threat, it will act sensibly, and it will not act in an arbitrary, tyrannical manner by, let's say, stealing the property of the individuals who compose it and dishing it out to people who don't have property, or something similar. Let's say a similar danger would be that the government secretly, but also without trying to hide it very well, signs the executive power over from the nation, where the individual is represented, to a foreign nation. And in Locke's time, this would have been to sign England over to control by Rome and the Catholic Church, whereas in our time, it would be to sign the nation over to control by the European Union. Usually, governments are sensible enough to avoid doing such a destructive thing, and so they aren't usually overthrown. And if only a small number of people object to these things, then they will be simply treated as criminals. But when the vice of the government is so great that everyone can see it, then only in that case will the government be overthrown and dissolved. The kind of Locke's attitude is, he has observed the activity of normal people and crowds, and on the basis of his experience, revolutions would be infrequent. This philosophy could only be, with great anachronistic use of the word, be called liberalism. In our time, liberalism means a kind of totalitarian government working on behalf of the technocratic elite. and having an imperial attitude towards the people, and a rather hostile attitude towards the law of nature. The liberalism of our time tends to be contrary to the law of nature by treating the individual as something which is powerless in the face of universal laws. And liberalism in our time tends to be contrary to law by making up all kinds of anti-natural claims, such as that men don't need property, or that men can become women, and so on. This is what people usually mean in our time by the word liberalism. And notice also that in order to achieve these anti-natural things, liberal governments of our era tend to have to carry out totalitarian types of constraint on the people by things like lockdowns, forced immigration, and so on. This is the typical activity of a modern liberal government. This is not what is meant when we say classical liberalism. So the word liberalism no longer means what it might have meant when it was used to mean a government which prioritizes individual freedom within a lightly regulated nation, where the entire force of the collective is brought to bear on an offender against the individual. Notice that in the classical liberal sense, the power of the state is brought to bear, and I mean also the power of the people, is brought to bear collectively on criminals, usually people who attack property or life. And life itself is a property belonging to God. But apart from by clamping down on crime, the state did not involve itself in the lives of the people. In the classical liberalism, the only demands on a man are that he have loyalty to that nation and not engage in theft or arbitrary violence against other members of the community. And the ultimate end of the government, the ultimate purpose of it, is the preservation of the property of any individual. He says this in section 93 of the Second Treatise. What Locke has written is clearly a kind of aspiration, or a description of what he sees as the underlying powers and forces and motivations for society in England in his day. So it's an aspiration for what will happen after the Glorious Revolution. And it's probably a description of what everyone else at the time who was in favour of the revolution wanted. The main power of the state is that it takes from all of its members the right to murder, except in cases of immediate danger to life, and the state in this way also arrogates to itself the power to kill any of the members of the society if they break the law in a certain way. And we say this traditionally about the state, that it's distinct from other organisations in that it has the power of life and death over members of the community. For once an individual has surrendered his right to defend himself with violence, the government has the duty to exact that punishment at a later date on his behalf, whether in the death sentence or in some other form of punishment. So basically, a civil society is one in which property can be defended by appeal to an objective independent law or a court, rather than by appeal to the immediate law of nature, which is retributive and immediate. And a man loses the right to use force to protect his property and hands that right over to the government. And where the government no longer protects his property for him, or actively sets out to destroy or it sets out to steal his property, and it does this on a widespread scale with many members of the community, then it must be in the nature of things dissolved. It no longer has the right to act as a government, and the community reverts back to a state of nature where men must take the law into their own hands, which is what happened in 1688. Those who approve of this kind of society, the one I've just been describing, the classical liberal one, which is little better than a state of nature, but is regulated by an impersonal legal authority in which the individuals remain more or less every man for himself in economic terms, they would still think of this as a liberal society, or perhaps as ultra-liberal. But we've gone over this now, and it's a trivial matter to give it a name, so let us continue to call it classical liberalism. If there's one distinction between this classical liberalism and the contemporary liberalism, it is this. The classical one is also ultra-nationalistic and patriotic, while contemporary liberalism appears not to be loyal to any nation, and hence, in Locke's terms, it is, knowingly or not, driving mankind back to a state of nature. Because if the foundation of the state is loyalty, which is what he says it is, and loyalty is in our day being eroded, or even in some cases made illegal, then if Locke is right, our nation state will revert back to nature, where men must look after their own property. And when it is attacked by anybody, they have the demand is on them to use all kinds of force to stop it. You could say that it wouldn't be right to call the typical man in a state of nature a vigilante. Rather, he is an individual whose reason tells him, at all costs, defend yourself and defend your property. And since the state has given up the power of life and death, the individual must assume that disastrous, probably unwanted power. It is, that is to say, illogical and destructive to try to ban loyalty and patriotism to the nation, which is what contemporary liberals in power often try to do. And contemporary liberalism, it seems to me, should be thought of as dangerous and destructive because it is taking individuals back to the state of nature. Classical liberalism, the only form of civic government which Locke is concerned with, differs from tyranny or absolute monarchy because the executive has to abide by laws created by the legislative. And the ultimate ruler of the liberal state, in the classical sense, is the law. And the law is drafted by representatives of the members of the society and the community. But we should also say it differs quite a bit from the situation in England today, since the executive in England, for various reasons, currently has control of approaching 50% of all the disposable property of the nation. Somehow the state has arrogated to itself almost half of the productive output of the nation. And it has done this by working as both a legislative and executive in one. And the difference between the executive and legislative is today only nominal. The dominant party in the House of Commons both makes the laws and also sees that they are carried out, which is something which in past times has led to civil wars due to the temptation which the legislative plus the executive has towards using power arbitrarily for its own ends rather than the ends of the people. When Locke discusses the character of the laws which should be made by the legislative, that is, by the House of Commons, by the House of Lords, and by the King, as closely as possible, he says, they should resemble the laws of nature, and they should follow, and the laws of nature were delivered to us by God. The law of nature, to repeat, is that a man shall survive and look after his property. When the law of the nation and the legislative bring about laws which are distant or contrary to that law of nature, then it has gone away, it has veered far off from the course which it should be on. You could say that the guide for any lawmaking should be the law of nature, which is quite a simple law. Because basically the state is taking over the care and protection of individuals, whereas in the state of nature, they have to do it for themselves. At the same time, the individuals in a state of nature are permitted to gather as much property as they need or want. And when the government is interfering in this right, there's give and take in here I can accept. But when it veers too far away from that principle, it's veering away from the law of nature and is in danger of dissolving itself. What Locke has said, which represents an aspiration as much as a description of England, seems to me to be still in existence today. It has been in existence since at least 1688, and in a more debased form for some time before that, because the three elements which were necessary for the state which he describes, namely the executive, legislative, and the property-owning class, were already there and are still here today. I quote from section 213. His preferred form of government. Let us suppose, then, the legislative place in the concurrence of three distinct persons. 1. A single hereditary person having the constant, supreme, executive power, and with it the power of convoking and dissolving the other two within periods of time. The other two persons are the assembly of hereditary nobles, and 3, an assembly of representatives chosen pro tempore by the people. Pro tempore means for a period of time. What perhaps is missing from our time is the following. I quote again at length. I've already just said this maybe, but this is again, Locke discussing the supreme power of the people. He says, though in a constituted commonwealth, standing upon its own basis, and acting according to its own nature, that is, acting for the preservation of the community, there can be but one supreme power, which is the legislative, to which all the rest are and must be subordinate. Yet, the legislative, being only a fiduciary power to act for certain ends, there still remains in the people a supreme power to remove or alter the legislative, when they find that the legislative acts contrary to the trust reposed in them. For all power given with trust for the attaining an end, being limited by that end, whenever that end is manifestly neglected or opposed, the trust must necessarily be forfeited, and the power devolve into the hands of those that gave it, in the first place, who may place it anew where they shall think best for their safety and security. And thus, the community perpetually retains a supreme power of saving themselves from the attempts and designs of anybody, even of their legislators, whenever they shall be so foolish or so wicked as to lay and carry on designs against the liberties and properties of the subject. For no man, or society of men, having a power to deliver up their preservation, or consequently the means of it, to the absolute will and arbitrary dominion of another, whenever anyone shall go about to bring them into such a slavish condition, they will always have a right to preserve what they have no power to part with, and to rid themselves of those who invade this fundamental, sacred, and unalterable law of self-preservation, for which they entered into society. And thus, the community may be said in this respect to be always the supreme power, but not as considered under any form of government, because the power of the people can never take place till the government be dissolved. What he's saying here is the supreme power of the people is not a government power. It's a riot power. And it's a kind of latent but supreme power inside the government, continuously threatening to overthrow the formal part of the legislative. In this way, we're reminded that the supreme power of the people does not take the form of a political party or a set of members of the government, but rather the power of destroying the government in a rebellion. So it is not a political force, I mean the people and the community, nor has any political form, but is the supreme right of a people to overthrow the government in an act of apolitical violence or force. And this is the realistically highest power and authority of the English or British society. What happens after the rebellion is in the hands of heaven, and it would be better if there were no rebellion, far infinitely better. And this is the kind of restraint which is placed upon the monarch and the executive and legislative, the three parts of our government, that they should always remember that they are not actually in complete control of the situation, and that they remain in control only while they fulfill their original bond, which was to preserve the liberties of the individual and preserve his property, and to carry out the law on his behalf. The reason that the executive and legislative are separate is because the temptation of those who have the power to make laws to suit themselves is likely a grave temptation among any kind of man or class. It would be my suspicion that the legislative class of our time have been acting in confederation with other national governments around Europe, so that the legislative of England is the same thing as the executive, and that the people have no recourse except to dissolve the government if it continues to federate itself surreptitiously with other governments around Europe, rather than serving its principal purposes of the preservation of the people. It would be a question to ask, and I do ask, whether the people who set up the European Union and the governments of Britain since that time, who've generally been moving the British people towards membership of the European Union, whether they thought that this was the best way or the only way of preserving the property of the British people and preserving their liberty. I don't know. I think that they did it in secret. If it was such a useful, they did it step by step. If the European Union truly were the best means and the only means which sensible people thought for acting according to the rules of nature and letting the individual survive at all costs and protecting his property, if the European Union were the only means to achieve those ends on behalf of the people, then I think it would have been more widely broadcast. But the truth is, it is not the only means, and more than this, the European Union is not even a representative form of government. There is a sort of nominated class of people in the Commission, and whatever representation people have in the European Union is merely advisory. And so, if the European Union, as it currently stands, were to become the full form of British government, which is what has been intended as far as I can see, then the reason for the British person agreeing to be governed in the first place would have been taken away. We agree to be governed because we think it's a good deal to have the whole body of the community on our side when we face trouble. This is not the reason why the European Union exists. The European Union exists merely because there is government and you'll just have to live with it. It's a kind of tyranny. And I also think that it has grown up in such a way at this time that there isn't really any possibility of population rebelling against it, because it's a government without any real place. It's a government which hasn't yet called on the loyalty of the people and so on. To me, it appears to be a step-by-step, slow movement towards the formation and the imposition of a government upon all of the people who live in Europe. And it's with more or less collusion by the people who are in charge of our separate nations. The word traitor is in it for most of the politicians who have been had executive power in England over the last few decades. Is kind of useless. They are not traitors. They're something else. But it's not my purpose to discuss the European Union in this talk. We could say that the government, which is not respecting the people of Britain, but has the aim of confederating it with the EU, a plan which is shared among almost all the legislative, that government is ignorant of the supreme power of the people to overthrow the government. Meanwhile, it is acting in what could be called an imperial way or a tyrannical way. so that the people are being made slaves rather than voluntary members of the community. If we look back at what the definition of a slave is, it's a situation where a man's property can be taken from him at will, and he has agreed, knowingly or not, to put up with that situation rather than to die. A slave is a person who has been overcome in war and prefers to live, but in a state without any rights, rather than be put to death. You do get the impression that since men have no alternative but to belong to this situation, other than to die, that there's gradually the European Union does revert back to a state of nature where the strongest, namely the Central Commission, and in our time the legislative, allied strongly with the executive, who has absolute power and can also make the laws, behaving like a tyrant. And in a state of nature, tyrants are possible because they have the strength and they simply do arbitrarily what they want. And the people who have to suffer from the tyrant are what you call slaves. And this is a state of nature. It is not a state of civic society. This is something which possibly you could say we're crossing over into. Because in Locke's theory, unless a man has absolute freedom and the government protects his property as his own right, and this is the hallmark of a civic society, if it's not a civic society, then it is a state of nature in which slavery and war and tyranny preponderate. A slave is defined by Locke as the situation of suspended death sentence, in that they would the slave would rather go on living in a way which deprives him of his natural freedom temporarily rather than die. What concerns us today, when society is on the verge of being overthrown and dissolved into a state of nature of slavery or tyranny or whichever, is that England was, as envisaged and described by Locke, a single entity of voluntary and free members. The members owed their loyalty to the state and were either part of it or not. Foreigners remained foreigners until they had given a promise of loyalty to no other society but the British one. The land of Britain belongs to the people whose parents brought them into the world as children, and who passed the land that they had worked onto them as their right by natural law. And no government should ever break that law, because the law of nature which reigned when parents gave their inheritance to the children and had the right to survive should be mirrored in the contemporary government. And the government should never break the law which says that only British people should be part of the community, and in this way ensure that nobody can share in the benefits of the property of the parents handed on to the children. To invite foreigners to share in those things is to break the law of nature. Now, there probably is a certain amount of foreignness which can be tolerated, especially when the foreigners are fully committed to belonging to Britain. But in a situation where the vast numbers of foreigners arrive and who are clearly it's not possible for them ever to be loyal to Britain, then the government has broken the law and broken its original covenant with the people when they just signed up to it. Locke says that the government is bound by an oath, just as the people are. He says, "I will not dispute now whether princes are exempt from the laws of their country. But this I am sure, they owe subjection to the laws of God and nature. Nobody, no power, can exempt princes from the obligations of the eternal law. Those are so great and so strong in the case of promises that omnipotency itself can be tied by them." He means by this that even God is bound by promises. Grants, promises and oaths are bonds that hold the Almighty. Whatever some flatterers to princes of the world who all together, with all their people joined to them, are in comparison of the great God, they are but as a drop of the bucket or a dust on the balance, an inconsiderable nothing. It is largely because of uncontrolled immigration that there is no unity in the nation today, but rather factionalism and polar factionalism, so that, in their ideas, the two parts of the society to which we now belong are enemies in every detail. I mean to say that there is this thing that they now call the left and the right, and the left has a set of ideas, and if you want to belong to the left, then you must follow all of those ideas, almost without exclusion, on, let's say, abortion, or immigration, or taxation. The left have a single mind, and on the other hand, there's the other faction, which is the right, and they have ideas about those immigration, abortion, taxation, foreign policy. It's polar factionalism, and this country is therefore split into at least two, where in every detail the factions have no common ground. There is also in our time a degradation or downgrading of our people, who are voluntary members of the community, remember, and the degradation and downgrading of them by a new influx of a new type of people invalidates their original commitment to one another. And the people are forced in this way to share their property, which was handed on to them in general by their parents and ancestors, with newcomers who are unaccountable, and yet who are unaccountably considered almost immediately to be members alongside them. You could say that we do not have to that the British people do not have to share their property with the newcomers. This is a lie. The government takes taxation from the British people at around 50%. It then has the power to distribute this property around wherever it sees fit, and it is distributing it to foreign people who have no loyalty to our country. In the perspective and the framework of classical liberalism, this situation is absurd. The other problem is the hardness of hearing, or the poor governmental practice of the legislative class, who are themselves now almost just one of the factions, a mere group, rather than the representative government of the people in the community. I have listed these things in order to show the kind of degeneration of the liberal system and the danger that we're in, because the dissolution of the government into a state of nature is taking place before our eyes in the framework of Locke's system. It only needs to be pointed out in our time that the executive and legislative, which are dangerously the same thing and have been consistently for several decades, that they exert power over the people of Britain as if they were governing an imperial province. It's frequently said in our time that the elite assume that they know better than the rest of us. This is just another way of saying that they govern as an imperial class. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the imperial attitude is encouraged by membership of the European Union, because that is how the European Union governs. The people are simply managed and shifted about and replaced where necessary, as it was the case in Britain's empire, where populations from one country would be shifted en masse into another country. But there is a simple explanation for this, and a good one, namely that many of Britain's problems, in particular the Northern Ireland problem, could have been solved by the creation of the European superstate. And so it has been a kind of subtle desire of the governing class of our time to resolve its problems by abdicating responsibility and joining the European superstate, which will resolve those problems. Because a European state to which both Ireland and Britain belong would allow the problem of Northern Ireland to simply disappear. And at the original foundation of the European Union, it was asked whether if Germany and England could both belong to an overarching political community, would any animosity between them in future be possible? And so they created the European Union for that purpose. The consequence is that the British state is simply being dissolved step by step. It was not done all in one movement. It has been done over many decades, because this is a colossally difficult task. And it's a colossally difficult task because it's basically contrary to all the rules of nature and our state. So it has to be done quietly. I was reading an article in The Spectator recently about a certain, I think his name was Oatesley, an MI6 agent who was dealing with the Northern Ireland troubles. And the background of all of his activity, and the reason why they were so soft on the IRA, is because they were hoping for a very quick solution to the Northern Ireland problem by the coming of the European Union to engulf both Britain and Ireland. Anyway, it has been the sometimes obvious policy of the government to hand the nation over without its consent to a different government. Do we need to refer to Locke to know that this is a crime and that it is a reason for the people to overthrow the government? Let's see what Locke says. The people's right is equally invaded and their liberty is lost, whether they are made slaves to any of their own or to a foreign nation. And in this lies the injury, and against this only have they the right of defence. And there are instances to be found in all countries which show that 'tis not the change of nations in the person of their governors, but the change of government that gives the offence. What he means by this is if you surreptitiously hand the government of a people over, so you have a people in a specific place, and they have their government, which would be led by, let's say, King Charles III and the House of Parliament. If you surreptitiously hand over the government of that people to, so the people are then now governed by something called the European Union with a commission and so on. This is a loss of their liberty, he says here. The people's right is invaded and their liberty is lost when they're made slaves to any of their own or to a foreign nation. And the European Union is a foreign nation. And they are injured, and against this only have they the right of defence. And he says it's not a change of the king, let's say, that would cause an offence to people, or it's not even the change of a dynasty. So you could, after King Charles III, there may be a king of another name, another dynasty. This is not what causes people offence. It's the change of the government itself from, let us say, the British state to the European Union state. And they have a right of defence. The people have a right of defence. When he describes the origins of states as the need to defend property and to survive and to avoid the state of war, because people form states in order to avoid a continuous perpetual state of war in nature, he also recounts the origin story of the origin of money as a non-perishable store of goods, so that men can share their labour and exchange it in a form which will not need to be spent or used immediately. For instance, if a man works all year and has a huge store of plums, then he has about 3 or 4 weeks to eat them all. Whereas if he shares them out amongst the community, he can keep that store of plums in the form of money collected from the other people. And so he doesn't need to eat the whole lot in 4 weeks. He can gather the money which he's gathered from selling the plums and gently spend that money over the rest of the year, which is the purpose of money, or the original purpose. Can I just point out that money is also perishable in our time, which is what inflation is. There is nothing now which is imperishable and withstands the effects of time. If you were to say that gold is imperishable and will last forever and retain its value, this is not strictly true, because the exchange value of gold also can be made to fluctuate and lose or increase in value. Anyway, this is another story. But we know what Locke would have thought of this, for he saw it in the time of James II, and I mean what he would have thought of the takeover of a country and it being handed over to a foreign power. He saw it in the time of James II, who fully desired to put the control of Great Britain into the hands of Rome. But as for me, I leafed through the book, the two treatises, and noticed that, as a result of his set of basic principles which I've described, there are dozens of interesting conclusions and results of those principles when they are put together, but it is not my business to continue to list them here. I suppose I would advise the reader to look at you to look at the book yourself. I have now written a postscript. What is the postscript about? I think I'm looking at the socialists of our time, and in particular one of the early socialists, and one of the more intelligent ones, namely Bertrand Russell and his reading of Locke. But earlier in my book, and I'm talking about the book which I'm writing about the troubles of Great Britain, earlier in my book I had noticed, in what appeared to me at the time to be an inadequate and embarrassing way, the rather obvious fact that the external world is real. Everyone knows that the external world is real. I inarticulately made this principle that the external world outside of the human being is real, and I can now articulate it with more precision what I meant to say. I now feel better able to explain what I meant by this. I had meant that what matters to anyone is what he gives serious attention to. And what he gives serious attention to is, for him, what is real. What he wants to understand and what he wants to find meaning in is what, effectively, alone really exists for him. This strange situation, this arbitrariness of reality, applies only to the individual life. You could also say that it applies to the community of a nation as a whole, where they simply ignore many facts of reality in the pursuit of their culture. But I'm dealing with the myself here and the individual life. And the strange situation applies to the individual life. And I would say that it also applies to the nation, where the nation is unanimous and has one mind, which is what a culture is. Cultures differ from one another with their priorities, and for some cultures, freedom simply is not a problem, and they don't seek for it and they don't notice it. In Britain, freedom of the individual is a major part of the reality of our lives. I don't think it was a major part of the lives of people in communist Russia, and so communist Russia did not really consider freedom to be real. It didn't exist. This strange situation applies only to the individual life and the national life in a unity, and it is in the nature of individual existence, which is the condition that everyone is in. So if a man is to attempt to deny that anyone else in the external world is real, then he's entitled to do so. But to say this to other people would be foolish. To deny that other people are real, fine. But when you're talking to those other people, to deny that they're real is foolish. But this is the way in which he leads his inner life. And he is entirely entitled to live in this way. This is due to the unavoidably subjective way in which we actually live. From this perspective, other people generally don't need to exist. If one is a hermit, for example, and the other types of hermits which are common in our time. You don't necessarily have to live in a cave to be solitary in our era. It is known, surely, by any hermit that, in an objective but distant way, other people are real. But it is a matter of degree, when that man then considers them to have, at best, an indifferent or irrelevant existence relative to the other things which really count towards his sense of reality and being alive. There's a kind of spectrum of reality. When one says that the outside world and other people do exist in a meaningful way, then in my case I mean this, that I now take an interest in politics and in general society. If nowadays I say that the external world does exist, it is because I have become interested in history and politics, whereas before I was entirely interested in religion, for which the existence of other people is not necessary. This harks back to Locke's theory of the state of nature, where men principally live on their own, with a family, of course, and we were talking about, theoretically speaking, they are individual, and they live individually. And so there's nothing improper with a man in our age living in that way, as if to say other people simply don't matter, excluding his family, of course. But if somebody then says the external world is real, he steps over into the area of politics, because politics takes external realities seriously. I noticed in Locke's work that in the crossover from the state of nature to the state of civil government, this crossover is affected by a change in loyalty. As Locke has said, when a criminal attempts to steal property from a man who is a member of a civil community, then the entire nation's power draws itself up and throws itself down upon the criminal to punish him. In this sense, a member of a civil society has lost his individuality and become a part of a greater, more powerful body. And so long as it acts according to the law which he approves of, which is a self-preservation law, it is great benefit to live in a civil society. He has changed his way of existing and his relationship to himself. His individuality and freedom is now retained, but it has the character of something which he shares with everybody else. And this relationship of the individual to everybody else is a relationship of loyalty. And the state and the attitude towards himself which he has as a member of a community is what we know as nationalism, patriotism. And patriotism seems to me in this way to be absolutely essential to a classical liberal government. A man in his civil society is loyal and devoted to the state and to the other members of his community. We can see in this way in which Locke is also concerned to say that foreigners remain foreign, and that even if a man has consented to the civil society of one land, he yet remains outside another, which is to say, civil society is always a distinct one amongst possible others, and a man can choose which one he wants to belong to. I think it's also a given that once he's chosen, he can't change. It's in the nature of promises that you can't withdraw your promise or your oath. At another time, we'd have to discuss the exact meaning of this idea of promise and oath and how binding they are. Locke's opinion was that once God has made a promise, even God must obey the vow he's made. This is the foundation of the civil society. It's a promise made to one country for an indefinite length of time, and a length of time which cannot really end without the breaking of the oath. Without this dedication, a civil society in Locke's sense cannot exist, cannot last anyway. This is what makes membership of a civil society perilous for a man's soul, as well as for his property, since the fate of his country, which he has chosen to submit to and to give up, and he has chosen to give up his individual freedom on behalf of, that country draws him along with it, and the fate of his nation is now his fate. Worse and more perilous still, when that country starts to disintegrate, his soul, being tied up so deeply with the fate of the nation, also starts to be injured and to decompose. His soul's composure, his individual self-consciousness, is now tied up with the condition of the state to which he belongs, the nation to which he belongs. this is why people are naturally drawn to fight for their country. They don't have to be told. People who are happy with their nation and it's a well-run nation will voluntarily give up their lives for its continuance. In a time when a nation is disintegrating, the individuals who are part of that nation also start to disintegrate, and they become angry and upset. And when asked to carry out service for the country, they tend to express themselves in a negative way. A recent survey of young people in Great Britain asked those young people whether they would fight and voluntarily join up and fight for Great Britain in any of the wars which are currently available to them, such as against Russia or Iran, or maybe on behalf of Palestine, some idiotic. There aren't any wars that people would be involved in our time, as it happens. However, only 5% of the young people said that they would sign up and fight for their country. Now, as we've already said, people under the age of 21 aren't generally old enough to understand what their nation is, and they're not able to. They ought not to be asked to commit to a nation until they've reached a maturity of mind sufficient and had enough experience. Why people are allowed to vote at the age of 16 in parts of our country, therefore, stands as something we should ask ourselves about. But yeah, the age of 21 is the age in which Locke, at a time when people lived far shorter lives, maybe the age of 21 was only half their life, or maybe at best a third of their life. But a third of their life was lived without any political responsibility whatsoever. In any case, my point that I was trying to make here is that my soul, and I would think if yours hasn't, then you aren't loyal to our country. Anyone who is loyal to our country must have been feeling certain pain and attacks to their sense of happiness and composure by the disastrous events about immigration of recent times. And what I'm doing here is I'm explaining how that should be necessary, and it's inevitable that you should feel like this in our time, because if Locke is right and his theory of government is right, then you ought to be feeling that you're being personally attacked. You're being personally attacked whilst your nation is being attacked. And this is a logical thing. It's a necessary thing, unavoidable. You could say that being part of a nation, the integrity of an individual is compromised. And in the best case, the majority of the time, he has signed up and his integrity is compromised, but he has gained the support and power of the community. So the sale, as it were, of his integrity was a good one. Where his integrity has been sold in order to a nation which is falling apart, he is no longer suffering from a good deal. The state of nature is to be an individual, while the condition of a man in a civil government depends on the success and welfare of that nation, that civil government. A man feels it personally when things beyond his control occur, when he has become part of a civil government. This is a feature of loyalty to a nation, and it seems to me that Locke believed that this sacrifice of individual identity, so as to assume the identity of the nation, is a difficult thing to explain or understand, but is nonetheless what happens to a man in the state. His welfare is its welfare, and we would call this relationship one of patriotism. The country in which a man belongs literally must become his country, over which he has some claim to ownership. And again, if he has claim to ownership of his country, and then he sees it being shared out with foreigners willy-nilly, and even on the sole say of the foreigner who comes, he feels that he is being directly robbed and stolen from. Whereas in a state of nature, this would call up attempts to defend his country with murder and or any means of survival which can come to hand. We find ourselves now with no means of survival and no means of defence. This appears to be, well, it's either due to the ineptitude of the current crop of government or the degeneracy of our constitution over time, or from conscious decision from some spooky dark room somewhere full of conspiracists who are trying to ruin Great Britain and make it part of the European Union, for example. and hence the distress which will arise when the country becomes defaced and ruined by, for instance, mass migration of foreigners who share its life without pledging any loyalty to it, and who have no right to have any of the property. And yet, as we've pointed out, the government is giving them our property. This kind of thing is an existential crisis for a true member of the society. This kind of thing is little different from a hostile invasion and the dissolution of the state, as far as he can see. And he feels it as a personal attack. I think that over the many decades of movement towards the condition that we are now in, through the 60s and the 70s, they made it, the governments, in order to prevent people from feeling outraged by the immigration, made it illegal to be racist. They called it racism. An angry response of personal, emotional harm and physical destruction of our property and handing over to foreigners was called racism, and it was made illegal. And this has only increased with time, because as generations have grown up, they think of racism as something which will put them in prison, and so they want to stay well clear of it. However, take away the name racism from it, it is basically something which is natural for people to feel, and it should not be illegal. Because what is happening is threatening the survival and is threatening the property of the people who live in Britain, the British people. And how they feel about it is kind of the voice of God speaking in them, according to Locke's theory. The dissolution of government has two forms, it seems to me. Locke does not discuss at any length the fact that voting can replace one set of legislators with another. And voting did take place in Locke's time, but it's not essential. As long as the representatives are members of the community and are working on behalf of those members of the community, then this is sufficient. There doesn't need to be any voting. This is the one form of dissolution of government where you replace one set of legislators by another. The other form of dissolution of government is what you might have seen in 2024, the incipient outbreaks of it in the riots. And I have thought sometimes, why do the rioters attack the police and not the obvious source of their anger, which was an immigrant who killed children? And they attack the police because the breakdown of a society, which is what's happening, the dissolution of a government, would be the attack on police and government itself. So a rebellion doesn't usually take the form of attacking personal enemies, such as murderous Islamic knife murderers. It usually comes down in the first instance to attack on the police and the authorities, because what's going on there is an incipient dissolution of government. If the government cannot protect us, as it were, then it has to go. What will come after, as before, is in the hands of heaven. We don't really know what will come after, but it simply has to go, because a government which is betraying the people and their freedom and endangering their survival simply has to be destroyed. It's broken its oath. It's betrayed the people. It's what you might call an abomination. It's a great crime. This is how rioters generally feel when they see the police across from them during a riot. But this is now then. My point in raising this question was that I do not see any signs of this kind of destruction of the government in our time, in this year. And it is far preferable to change the group of legislators who are in office. And Locke does accept that the Commons are pro tempore, and they can be removed. Voting is not necessary, especially in his view of it, as long as they are real representatives of the people's interests, and the people's interest is their survival, then it's enough. I'd also like to make, it occurs to me along the way while we're discussing this, that perhaps there is a significant number of perhaps even a majority of people in this country who simply want to hand the nation over to foreigners. I think such people would be very stupid, to say the least, but it's possible. So you could say the representatives currently in office in 2026 have a mandate to replace the British people with foreigners, and that the British people are happy with this. This is possible, but I call them stupid, because if they understood the rules why we have government in the first place, they would realise that such an intention of being replaced is contrary to the theory on which our society was established, namely our own self-preservation. So even if the British people did have the idea of finding representatives who would make them be replaced, they still wouldn't really be entitled to such representatives. I also finally notice that Locke has not said, but he implies in his theory of the state that Christianity, or the individual self-relationship, because Christianity is the religion of self-relationship and the relationship with God as an individual. Christianity, the religion of individual life before God, continues inside the civil society as it has been described in the second treatise. There is a great yawning gap in his description of the civil government in the second treatise, which is in our time filled with socialist organisation of the economy and the totalitarian management of the population and its property, with the 50% of property ownership and so on, as I've described, by the government. But this great yawning gap, which is today filled with socialism, this, I think, was left empty by Locke, since he believed that Christian individuals, if he assumed that each man must be in a society an individual and a Christian, he assumed that they are free to organise their public interactions as they see fit, in freedom, rather than that they be managed by the government. So Locke gives no instructions about how they shall be ordered about by the government in the way in which we are ordered about today, and in which our nation is planned by the government. Rather, the freedom of the individual to just do as he pleases within the law and within the restraints on property is the only rule which we needed. And it's the only activity government should get involved in. A man has given up his freedom by joining the civil society, but he regains it in full, or perhaps infinitely, by being an individual before God. And in God's eyes, he remains in a state of nature. The state, so to speak, has nothing to do with God whatsoever. And in God's eyes, each man continues to be in a state of nature, by which I mean he is alone. He is responsible for himself alone. You could not, for instance, claim, I think Locke would say, you cannot claim before the throne of God in the afterlife, I did well by supporting my nation, or I did well by taking part in social projects on behalf of the government. You only do well in your not by calling on the glories and achievements of your society, only by what you have personally achieved and what you personally have been. So, again, by joining a civil society, a man kind of endangers his soul and starts to be drawn into things which, if he were on his own as an individual Christian, in the solitude of a cell, he would not have to get involved in. Whereas once he has given the real outside world some reality and started to take an interest in history and politics, his soul is in peril, because it's been split in half, and it is now also sworn to loyalty to other people. So he's kind of no longer fully in charge of his own, which is why the Christianity which Locke cherished and practiced was a private one, so that a man can retire from political work and for periods of time be by himself and communicate with God and make peace with God in that way. And in this way, the church, or the Christian, on the one hand, is separate from the state. Because the evil things the state must get itself involved in, such as, let us say that in the next decades there would be some kind of mass evictions of foreigners from Great Britain. This will be a painful period. And it will not be something which would a Christian, as a Christian, could tolerate. And so the state must be separate and must do its work of protection on behalf of the Christian. Besides which, Locke was not quite so squeamish as people in our times about fulfilling God's work by doing things such as murder for self-preservation. It is sometimes thought that Christians of our time are willing to die rather than harm other people, and that they would give away all of their property and so on and so forth. I've said elsewhere that this is a misreading of the teachings of Christ, because the only coherent way of understanding what Christ means is that each individual is the enemy of everybody else, but that he must forgive those enemies, and that he is on his own facing God, and that this is a spiritual message, and this is the gateway to eternity. Whereas when he is involved in politics and the world, the law which was described in the books of Moses applies. And this does say that you will preserve your life against your enemies, and you will not give away your property in a stupid way. But I've said this elsewhere. I would conclude with some remarks on Bertrand Russell's understanding of Locke, and be as brief as possible. His analysis of Locke's metaphysics, or rather his theory of knowledge, is quite good, and is better than mine as an explanation of the details of Locke's epistemology and his theory of knowledge. And we do not significantly disagree when we are talking about Locke's epistemology, or his theory of knowledge. But on politics, Russell makes some embarrassing mistakes and oversights, and even seems to be hostile to Locke, which makes him an inattentive reader. Russell does not understand that the state of nature has a law, and that Locke has said over and over that the law of nature has only one command, that is, to survive. Russell has the habit of rather asking, what is this law Locke is talking about? There must be a set of principles and rules and so on and so forth to guide the man of nature with his community. Well, the answer is this is Russell misunderstood. The law of nature is a one simple command, that you must survive. And it's balanced by the fact that obviously you should not steal off other people. But since the factor which alone matters is the individual, not the man in the community. So to say things like don't steal from other people, don't do this to other people, is irrelevant, because in nature a man is on his own. A community is a temporary thing, and has no real value to the man in a state of nature. So even the Decalogue in a state of nature has no real practical force, because the Decalogue is about in those aspects of it which are about your neighbour. In a state of nature, there is no neighbour. This is something Russell misunderstood. He misunderstood that the law is simple, and the law only applies to one person. The state of nature is also lonely and involves only one man. Not understanding this, Russell frequently asks inappropriate questions, such as asking what the law of nature can possibly be, as if he had been unable to hear Locke repeat over and over again that the law of nature is this, that you must survive. Russell also complicates matters with inappropriate questions, asking how men in a state of nature interact with each other. He asks how can they do so unless they have some kind of common law. In these questions, he has misunderstood that the state of nature involves only one man, and that he is isolated, and he is looking after himself. The condition of nature is not a social one in the least, since as soon as a social relationship arises, it does so either as war, or slavery, or as civil society. But the default condition is simple, isolated individualism. There are reasons why Russell was rather hostile to Locke, so that he did not sympathise enough to be able to follow the second treatise and read it properly, namely that Russell, as he hints here and there in his discussion in the 1944 History of Philosophy, that as he hints here and there, he was hoping for a world where men did not own any property. Whereas, as we know, Locke gave an almost divine quality to property ownership. Russell, on the other hand, was looking forward to a state where the state would organise the nation's activity in such a totalistic and non-consensual way that nobody would have any property. And even worse, it would be a world ruled by a single government from which no man could escape. The escape from the civil society is written into Locke's theory of civil government, because although men must be loyal to a state for life, they can also, in individual instances, in principle, they can escape. But to escape to another state would obviously be a treason. But their freedom and to return to nature is still permitted to them. But I suppose it would be one of the rules of the nation that anyone who does that cannot return, so as to maintain the integrity of the state, of the nation, and the civil government. In Russell's view of things, there would be no escape, because the entire world and the entire human population would be governed by a single world government. He says, on page 616, in his discussion of Locke, he says, "A new international social contract is necessary before we can enjoy the promised benefits of government. When once an international government has been created, much of Locke's political philosophy will again become applicable, though not the part of it which deals with private property." I don't know, I've got no idea what Russell means by much of Locke's political philosophy will become applicable. There's a very small core of political theory explained by Locke, and that is that there are three tiers of government, and that each man is free within that, the civil society. How this can become applicable in some future time, when it already is applicable, Russell would have to explain. What I think he means is that you'll be ruled by law. I have no idea what he means. What I do notice is that he's given us two rules here for how he wants the future to unfold. Firstly, there shall be an international, pan-global government. And secondly, that there will be no private property. And he was writing this in 1944, when Britain was fighting for its liberty. Anyway. What Russell did not understand about the origin of governments and such international contracts is that they require loyalty from the individuals who submit to them and compose them. Hence, an international government must somehow demand loyalty and submission from those who compose it, from the community. And for all that we know, most governments historically have come about by force of war. And for instance, the last invasion, the last significant change of the composition of the government of Great Britain took place in 1066. That was the last invasion. And I think that this should widely be considered to be the foundational moment of our nation. As I've already said at the end of the last presentation, and as Locke himself points out with respect to William I, conquest, to which he devotes a very short chapter, is one of the means by which a civil society either dissolves or is created. And a conquest can happen, and since it's the case of Great Britain, I think it's the case with most other nations. They are originally founded by a conquest. Now, when Bertrand Russell says that there will be a world government, to my way of looking at it, the only way that a world government could ever be formed would be by conquest. Because this is how loyalty and submission are always won. people only voluntarily want to be loyal to a nation when it has been established by a conquering power, which is also one which offers out the hand of membership. It offers its hand out to the people to become members, which is how they voluntarily become so. And this is what happened in England after 1066. It follows that a world government would require decades, or I would say centuries, of warfare before it could be formed. And I would say the same about Europe actually. Europe needs to be, if a European government is ever to arise, which I don't think it's I personally would not consider this to be an optimal situation for British people. But if a European government was ever formed, it would have to take place and assume power and get authority and legitimacy after a conquest. And for this reason, I think it would be preferable that the objective of world government, international government, it is preferable that the objective of international government is set aside indefinitely, and that it is preferable that nations continue to exist in a state of nature relative to one another, which leaves them open to the chance of war, but not of global tyranny. And besides, the global tyranny which Russell had in mind can only be achieved after what I would think of as centuries of warfare and conquest. And that's where I end this second presentation on John Locke. Thanks for listening. Leave comments if you like, and as they say, you can put a like on the page if you like. Thank you.